Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Voice TV. Our special guest tonight is painter, writer, and documentary filmmaker, also author of the book Creating Freedom, Empathy, and the documentary Lottery of Birth, Raul Martinez. Welcome, Raul, and thanks for being with us tonight.
Hey, Joanna, thank you for having me.
So Raul, my first question to you is your primary occupation is that you're a portrait painter, and you're probably one of the best portrait painters in Britain. Your portraits have been shown and exhibited at the National Portrait Gallery of Chomsky and Howard Zinn and a lot of others. You told me that that's the occupation that still pays your bills. So how come somebody that goes from painting, which is a very abstract art, decides to start writing and doing political documentaries as you have been doing recently? And how do you see these two parts of your life that are in a way different?
Wow, okay. Good, big question to begin with. Well, look, I've always, as a kid, I loved to draw, I loved to paint. It was something that I did because I liked the state that it put me in. It put me into a meditative state, and I would spend hours and hours just in my own little world, drawing things that occurred to me in my imagination, and trying to hone that craft. But although it has become, a big part of my life professionally, I found that I couldn't express a lot of what I wanted to express about the world through that particular medium. It's a fantastic symbolic medium, but if you want to explore, let's say, the political challenges that we face, if you want to delve deeply into philosophical questions, then I think there are other mediums better suited to it. So that's what sort of nudged me in the direction of initially filmmaking and ultimately writing the book Creating Freedom, which came out a few years ago. And I'd say over the last decade, I've ended up splitting my time fairly equally between painting, between writing and researching, and between filmmaking. They take me into very different situations and put me in touch with very different kinds of people. But I'm very grateful that my art has allowed me, in a way, subsidized some of the other more directly political work that I've been doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think that the only way maybe to do things that you really want is to have like this some kind of income that can in a way pay your bills, but then on the other hand have the freedom to do things as you do, as you're also a producer of most of your movies, which is also very interesting that you also want to in this way be independent, and when you make your documentary work, you really want to be the full author of the things you do, not to be dependent on some kind of other producers that would probably test and censor you in a way, or maybe give their opinion how they would do it,
The common theme linking my film, which is called The Lottery of Birth, and my book, Creating Freedom, is the notion of freedom, and it's something that creatively I value enormously. I have little interest in making films for the sake of making films, or writing books for the sake of writing books. You do it because you can't help but do it. There's something that you are driven to say, driven to explore. And so far in my life, I've been very fortunate. I've been lucky enough to sort of buy that freedom with the work that I've done professionally as an artist. But of course, to some extent, you sacrifice your freedom as a painter to do that. If all your work is commissioned work, then at least in that realm, you are painting to please, rather than painting from your own impulses as a starting point.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because you were telling me that with your paintings, you are very much sometimes commissioned by banks and by institutions that you criticize in your other work that you do. So do you sometimes feel like, you have these two people in you, one that is, still in a way dealing with these people, like taking money from them? That's what I don't know, as an artist sometimes think, okay, should I take money from this institution? It's a bad institution. But then I think, okay, but if I don't take the money, then I will not be able to work on other stuff. So how do you balance these two things? Does it happen sometimes that you think, I just want to, I don't care about this, I can't work anymore? Were you in a situation maybe sometimes as an artist, to say, okay, this I cannot do, really, this is the line I won't cross?
There are lines, and it's for each of us to kind of work out what we're happy with and what we're not. And part of that depends on our material privilege, really. There's a dialogue there, isn't there, between the options available and the principles we're willing to keep. But for example, I mean, the world's largest portrait painting competition is the BP Portrait Award at London's National Portrait Gallery, and I've participated in that a few times. But a few years ago, I declared publicly that I would cease to enter any works into that competition because it's sponsored by BP, and I've worked alongside a number of activist groups who are trying to essentially shame our cultural institutions for taking money from these fossil fuel companies at a point in our species' history where we're on the edge of self-destruction, primarily because of burning these fossil fuels. There's no excuse. So, I mean, that seemed to me like a line. I didn't want my work to be used as a way of greenwashing these institutions. And that's the only reason they give money. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart to support the artistic community. They're doing it to buy a sort of cultural license. It's very good PR for them. And, I think it's, in a way, it's a more significant artistic act as well as a political act to hold back our work from institutions while they are complicit in lending credibility to these, absolutely some of the most dangerous institutions on the planet, I would say, at this point.
Yes, and as you mentioned, your documentary, it is called The Lottery of Birth. And afterwards, after the movie, you actually did the book, Creating Freedom, which is like an extended version of the more precise version of the movie and all the topics that you were concerning in the movie. And for me, it was very interesting because you were talking about freedom from birth, from our birth, that we are shaped with a lot of things. You say that in a way we inherit our identity from birth, and that we don't choose a lot of things that happen to us. We don't choose the family we're going to be born into. We don't choose our social status. We don't choose our society. We don't choose our class. So we don't have a free choice there. And then, as Foucault would say, then come the institutions that we also don't choose, that are another way of systems of control, as are the education, of course, the healthcare system, even at the end, parliamentary democracy, that is, in a way, they say it's a freedom of choice, but of course it's not. And of course, the technologies and the internet. So we have this notion that we are living in a world that is more free than ever. That's what they are telling us. But then we find ourselves very much in these so-called freedoms today. And so I wanted to ask you, because your book is called Creating Freedom, is it really possible in the world today to create any kind of personal freedom, or whatever we do, we at the end get trapped back in all of these institutions and social structures that we are born into from the beginning?
I begin by saying, yes, we can create freedom, absolutely. But we are in a much stronger position to create freedom when we become increasingly aware of the limitations on our freedom. So the greater appreciation we have for the constraints placed on us by what you were talking about, the formative influences, biological, social, cultural, political. The fact that every aspect of our identity can ultimately be traced to, this interplay between biology and society. Once you confront that, I think you're in a much stronger position to start the journey. And it's a journey because there's not an end to it. It's a continual process of expanding our freedom. And I like to talk about it by making a distinction between internal freedom and external freedom. And I would say most of contemporary politics focuses on external freedom. So the capacity, it's all about power. It's a power to determine the future. And to the extent you're able to do that, we think we're free. And we recognize there are many things interact in our lives to increase or diminish this power to determine the future. So our class status, perhaps our gender, perhaps our sexuality, depending where we live, many, many things. And this is incredibly important, but often forgotten is the internal dimension. Think of someone in prison and the guard outside the prison cell. I think it's not incoherent to say that in some very important senses, a prisoner can be more free than a prison guard, when you take into account our internal dimension. So imagine someone who has practiced meditation their entire life. Imagine someone who is free from fear, insecurity, and the kind of endless chattering of the ego mind, which can debilitate us, which we have very little control over. We're very used to identifying with the words in our head and the feelings in our bodies. But just like we can't control, the economic upturns and downturns globally, most of us have almost no control over the next thought that is going to pop into our head or the next feeling. And many of these thoughts are actually incredibly corrosive and undermining. And so the wisdom traditions that have been around for millennia at this point have placed much greater emphasis on expanding our freedom in this internal space. It's the same principle of having the power to determine the future, but there are two dimensions to the future: the internal dimension and the external. And I like to make that explicit because in our society, we're absolutely right to highlight the privilege, the kind of quite nauseating, disgusting privilege almost of those with enough money to have a private race into space that we're seeing right now, right? Billionaires who have prioritized that over the health of the poorest and the neediest. That's true, but then you ask yourself, would you want to be those people if you had to experience their internal world? Would you want to be Donald Trump with all his billions while at the same time being subject to what I think is probably a hellish internal reality, full of insecurity, self-doubt, a form of madness, I would describe it as. So these forms of freedom are equally important, but I don't think we're ever, as collectively, as a society, going to create the external conditions for widespread freedom if we continue to neglect cultivating the internal conditions of freedom. They're absolutely in dialogue with each other, one the other.
Yeah, it makes complete sense because thinking about all of these problems with the external freedoms, I think that all of these freedoms, which you also talk in the book and also in the movie, all of these so-called freedoms, but these institutions that are supposed to be free, like, I don't know, the educational system that we are, that's the first thing, in life, that this first structure after the family that we have is, of course, the school, the education. When the starting point, you do not have freedom because they are in a way teaching you to obey these kinds of rules and to obey these kinds of practices that make your internal freedom the way it is. I really think it is interdependent, because what you are talking about is normal for a person that thinks it's not normal to have too much if somebody next to you has too little. If this is if you can, I still can't understand how somebody can feel good, free, happy, or whatever with having somebody next to him feeling terrible, and it's not even his fault. And I also think that today we are living in a world where everything is put on the individual, on this kind of individual freedom. And then I always remember Adam Curtis's great documentary, The Trap, and the first episode is called Whatever Happened to Our Dreams of Freedom, with all, with the ultimate goal of the beginning of the century, with, the individual freedom where you can liberate yourself, be whatever you want, you have a free choice to live wherever you want, to do whatever you want, to make millions if you want. But then we get, Tony Blair and George Bush talking about liberating and the free market and liberating other nations from autocracy and tyranny. Then we get these other forms of liberations where you have this notion that there are people that know better than other people. And then this internal freedom that you have in yourself, I don't think makes any kind of sense when you have these external notions that will be doing the liberation themselves. And then whatever you think, I think you just find yourself not being able to change anything because you're not the one in control of the liberation and the freedom.
Right, yeah. This is why freedom is such a powerful lens to kind of develop insights about society with. I mean, if you think about the dominant systems under which we live, capitalism and at least formal democracy, the way that they're often justified is with reference to freedom and conceptions of freedom. And so we have to very carefully interrogate those conceptions, those definitions of freedom that they're deploying. Because when I look around at the world, I don't think it's getting freer. I don't feel like we're heading in the right direction. And that's one thing I tried to do with these works, with the documentary and with the book. So just for example, I mean, we've had a good 4 decades now of neoliberalism, and that's been predicated on the ideal of freedom, but it's a very narrow conception of freedom. So for example, you go back to one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, Milton Friedman, and he really conflated his advocacy for capitalism and free markets with the ideal of freedom. He went so far as to say that he would favor capitalism over other economic systems simply, even if it was less efficient than they were, simply because it affords us the freedom to choose. And it sounds good. It sounds wonderful, right? And then you say, well, what do you mean by the freedom to choose? And the way he characterizes free markets is to say that they ultimately come down to voluntary, mutually beneficial transactions. So this is where the freedom lies, when you kind of pick apart and say, okay, what do you actually mean? It's voluntary, mutually beneficial transactions. And as soon as you think about it, you realize, hang on, this isn't the sort of freedom that we want. I try to highlight this by saying, imagine, Maya, you're walking down the street, and I hope this never happens, but imagine you're walking down the street and someone puts a gun to your head. And they say, give me your money or I'm going to take your life. Well, if you decide to hand over the money that's on you, that's a mutually beneficial transaction, right? They get your money, you get to keep your life. Was it voluntary? Well, of course it wasn't voluntary, because you were compelled by circumstances. But the error, if you like, the deceptive element in Milton Friedman's whole freedom edifice is that circumstances which compel people to act against their wishes are everywhere in the so-called free market. Every day, the freedom of individuals expands and contracts relative to the amount of spending power they have, the amount of money that they have. So, if you're dirt poor, you can't say no to a labor contract, even one that is demeaning, one that is dangerous. You don't have the freedom to say no because you are compelled by circumstance. So this is how freedom has been distorted. And actually, historically, it's something I think the left has we've given up the ideal. We allowed this ideal of freedom to be co-opted by the right. And it's a huge mistake. And I think part of the project that I'm interested in is redefining and reclaiming this ideal. for the values, the ends of all of us as progressives.
Yes, and it's very interesting that you said that the right co-opted it, because I think we were talking a couple of days ago, and we were talking about this world without meaning that happened at the end of this freedom trap we were forced into, because it's not a thing. It's not just a thing about freedom, but it's also a thing of getting some kind of a meaning in life. And then I'm also thinking that the problem actually a big problem with the left is that we still live in some kind of a Cold War, I think, where we still have capitalism being perceived as something where you have freedom, and any kind of socialist, idea is perceived as an autocracy and something that will eventually bring you to some kind of a Chinese model or a North Korean model or whatever, where, somebody, the state will be controlling you, and you will be, you will never be able to choose and shop and do whatever you want. And then, of course, we remember the famous quote by Margaret Thatcher, there is no such thing as society, And I think that really at this point, we have to say that we have lost the battle, and that we really live in a world that when we look around, we can say that there is no such thing as society. We can see that during this COVID crisis, what happened, what happened with Europe, which is supposed to be very democratic. Of course, before that, what happened with the migrant crisis, I don't want to talk about that part, which is, of course, a big story we can open now. But now, looking recently at the COVID crisis, how society dealt with this, and did we in a way show any kind of respect and solidarity from richer to poor countries with the vaccines and everything? And then at the end, you live in Britain, and you have a national healthcare system. I live in Serbia. We do here also. And then at the end, what was the thing that in a way saved the people? It was, the free healthcare, because the countries with a good free healthcare dealt with the pandemic much better. And then we think, okay, so this socialism is not so bad. It's not so, terrible as it seemed. And in this, Cold War rhetorics that I think still, in a way, exist. I think that now more than ever, we can maybe see that the end of this meaningless world would be a world where we would have a free healthcare system, free education, all the things that I think should be free, and which would make a system with less injustices and with less, division among classes.
Yeah, and look, at this point, given the severity of the climate, the ecological crisis, it's either that or the end of our civilization. That we now have a binary choice. It's no longer kind of pick your flavor, decide on your preference. Do you like capitalism? Do you like socialism? No. It's the imperative now is one of survival. It's coming from the material conditions which are being rapidly destroyed. What we need to do ASAP is to degrow our economies, which is a radical notion, even in many parts of the left. But this is what the science is saying. We need to degrow, particularly in the global north. The global north has to take the lead on this, to create the ecological space for the global south to continue growing for a while, because they will benefit from that growth. So we need to reduce the material resources we're using. We need to mobilize, which means the resources that we do use, we need to use for very different purposes than we're currently using them now. So that's essentially what we mean when we're talking about a Green New Deal and a global Green New Deal. Changing the ends to which we're putting our resources, becoming far more efficient at turning resources into human well-being. And thirdly, we need to equalize, because that is one of the most important ways to become more efficient in the use of resources. I mean, just very crudely, if I have 100 donuts and I need to feed 100 people, it's incredibly inefficient to give 80 donuts to one person and then try and feed the rest with 20. Essentially, that's what we're doing globally. So immediately you become far more efficient at turning resources into human well-being when you share, when you equalize. Now, what's interesting about those imperatives, and I think they flow directly from the science, is that they clash head-on with the imperatives of capitalism. So instead of degrowing our economies, at the very heart, the beating heart of capitalism is the imperative to grow year on year. And this is a value which has been embraced pretty much across the political spectrum for decades. That has to change. Instead of mobilizing for human need and human welfare, resources are mobilized for profit, and they're very, very different things. So right, just as one example of the madness, something like $10 million a minute from the world's governments goes to the fossil fuel industry in the form of subsidy, as continuous, endless subsidies. So that's a massive misallocation of resources, and again flies in the face, therefore, of the imperatives of capitalism, the need to mobilize. And then third, equalize. Well, again, you look at the dynamics of capitalism, which have been elucidated by many authors, from Piketty and many others, that show that concentration of capital, concentration of wealth over time is absolutely central to the dynamics of capitalism. So if we have a chance of overcoming or finding a way through this crisis, because I think at this point, there's no way of avoiding the crisis. It's begun, we're living through it. Each year for the rest of our lives is probably going to be materially more difficult than the one before. So it's about how we navigate it and reduce as much suffering as possible. But it's going to require overturning the logic of capitalism, those three pillars. There's simply no other way. I don't think this message has quite permeated the popular consciousness, but it absolutely needs to.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing as with the ecological crisis. I think that only the people that are directly involved with the crisis are knowing what is happening and what has been happening the last 100 years, of destroying the planet. But I think that the common people don't think about it at all and think it's an abstract thing. Okay, so you have these, melting of the Antarctica, or I don't know what, and rising sea levels. But I think that in a way it's still very abstract. I don't think people are realizing that it's happening. What you were saying now with the economic crisis also, it's also with the economic crisis. It happens day by day. It's happening now. It would be really, really weird that after the pandemic we don't have an economical crisis. So of course it's going to come. It's coming. It's the same with the ecology. Until something really huge happens, like a disaster, I don't think that people will be aware of the problem that we are facing now with destroying the planet. I think I don't know what's your opinion, but I think it's still a very abstract issue that most of us are still talking about it as something that we don't understand in a way, because our lives are not so much dealt with it. We maybe talk about, okay, maybe this summer is a little bit hotter than it was a couple of years ago, but that's like we're not thinking about what can really happen. As like a couple of years ago, we couldn't think that we would have a global pandemic, which happened.
I mean, my opinion on that is, I think there has been a lot more awareness in recent years of the scale of the problem, the scale of the challenge, and just it is affecting people's lives year on year. The temperatures, the impacts on the economy. Of course, at the moment, it's still largely in the global south where people are being most affected, and that allows people in the north to largely ignore, escape the direct effects. But for me, the real challenge is not so much just conveying the scale of it. I think increasingly people are getting a sense of that. And it took Extinction Rebellion, it took Greta Thunberg and all the school children striking across the globe. That had a real impact in the public consciousness. But what hasn't yet been achieved is showing the links between our economic system and the imperative for growth and these disasters, because that's the hardest thing for people to accept. We're talking about the need for revolutionary change, revolutionary because we just don't have time. It can't be a series of incremental, if systemic reforms. It has to be very quick and very deep change. That's what we're looking at. It involves taking on concentrated wealth, the most powerful industries on the planet. It involves all of these things. And there are some people who say, actually, it's counterproductive to say we need to overcome capitalism before dealing with this issue. But it's not a question that we have to overcome capitalism and then get to the issue. It's that in dealing with the issue, we have to dismantle and overturn the logic of capitalism. There's just not a way to deal with it while staying true to the logic of capitalism. Left to its own devices, it's going to carry on concentrating wealth, which is just hugely inefficient when our access to resources is dwindling year on year. It's going to continue expanding the amount of resources that we take from the planet, which is just going to worsen the crisis, and just misallocating everything. So yeah, that's the central message. And if you ask if I'm hopeful, I'm not hopeful about us doing that. I mean, I see plenty of reason to feel there's great meaning in the years ahead. There's great reason to act and to fight and to grow and connect with others and do all kinds of things. But I sort of feel that our civilization is akin to someone who's got a degenerative disease. It's going to get worse year on year for the foreseeable future, I think, for the rest of our lives. And we have to sort of have the wisdom and the courage to accept that reality. And then within that, work to do the very best we can do to reduce suffering and lay the foundations, hopefully, for generations of the future to eke out some kind of sane society, given what we're going to hand over to them.
Yeah, if we will hand over anything to them, we don't know, So yeah,
right.
I would love for us to see an excerpt of from your movie, The Lottery of Birth, and then we will continue to talk.
Okay, thank you.
Most people know that everything is broken. They know that the society is skewed for the people at the top. They know that it's unjust. So then why don't they rebel? Why isn't it enough to point out how bad things are, to make perfectly clear to people the extent to which millions die unnecessarily each year of poverty and of starvation and of lack of medical equipment and also of bombs falling on their heads, of billions of people denied a degree of dignity and control over their lives and even the most meager resources with which to fulfill their capacities. Why isn't that enough? Well, the reason it isn't enough is because Margaret Thatcher can get up and say there is no alternative. Suppose I said that there was this phenomenon that was so harsh, so deadly, so debilitating that it was the biggest killer on the planet. It killed far more people than war. It killed far more people than poverty. It killed more people than war and poverty combined. War, poverty, and sickness combined. And I said, come join me in a movement against this. And then I said, I was talking about aging. Which indeed does kill more people than anything else. And it limits us, and it restricts us, and it diminishes our options, and it diminishes our possibilities, and then it kills us. And if I said, come join me in a movement against it, you'd laugh at me. Everybody would laugh. They'd say, grow up, get a life, face reality. There is no such thing as a movement against aging. That's ridiculous. That's the way most people see capitalism. That's the way most people see the world around us. That's the way they see the injustices. They think it's just a fact of life. It's a part of existence. And so they think you just have to put up with it. This is a function of the educational system, of the positions that we find ourselves in, of the roles and the options that exist in society. We choose among that which is sort of put in front of us, which is made available to us. And if you do that often enough, you begin to forget that you could change the whole system.
Yes. While I was watching the movie, because there is a part called obedience, and it was very interesting that in the movie you were highlighting that that it wasn't disobedience, but obedience that made the worst world crimes in history. The obedient people were the ones that at the end were the ones that made all of the worst things happen, and worst crimes. And I was talking a lot. I was thinking a lot about disobedience and why people don't want to be disobedient in this kind of a world, even when they have the power to be. I, of course, understand what you were talking about before when you said that when you don't have money, you know, to pay for food, you're going to be obedient. That's completely normal. But then you have, I'm now talking about the people that are in a position, that have a privilege to risk, but they do not want to risk because they like their position as it is. And maybe they have a sense that something is wrong, but then because of these privileges, they are going to be the ones to say, you know, no, I'm not going to risk this. I'm just going to stay the way it is. And then it makes the whole status quo. And then in this kind of a world where the privileged will not say, I do not care now about my privileges because, you know, the world is going to be destroyed. Then I don't care if I can buy this or that. If, you know, I'm going to live in a world that will be completely ruined with people dying on the street of hunger. But why do you think that that disobedience is so rare and that you have very few people today? Are we living really in this society where you think that if you're disobedient, you'll be punished for it in this free world?
Right. I mean, cultivating obedience is how systems reproduce themselves. So let's look at the education system. Any education system in any society will have been designed to meet the needs of that particular society, that particular system. So I can look at my experience going through the education system, and I see there was an official curriculum and an unofficial curriculum. And the official curriculum, yeah, it takes reality, it carves it up into various disciplines and subjects, and you learn to think about the world in those ways. And that has its own problems. And some of that knowledge will be useful as you go forward in life. But I think that the more important function of the education system is the unofficial curriculum, which is the fact that your life is rigidly controlled. You're told often what to wear. Your day-to-day activities are determined by, you know, not your inner impulses, but by institutions that get to dictate to you, this is what you're going to study. This is what you need to learn. You have to sit still this many hours per day. We're going to give you, I mean, you know, like certain prisons, you know, you can go and exercise for 40 minutes now, and then if you come back, you have to sit down, you have to listen to what we're saying. And it's functional to the system. It's not irrational. That's what the system needs. Of course, the system has different requirements, and that's why in every society you have elite educational institutions. So from this country, we have Eton, for example, and it's very different. They are not being conditioned to passively accept orders from on high. They're being trained to give orders, and it's a very different education. They're cultivated, their confidence is cultivated in public speaking, in the sense of being entitled to make decisions on the behalf of others and other groups. But the majority of the population don't get that education. It's an education preparing them for work where they have no control of their work, where they often will find it deadly boring, if not demeaning. But by the time you leave the education system, be it kind of 15, 16 or later, you sort of, and again, this overlaps with the divide I was talking about before about the internal freedom and external freedom, because it's taken our potential for internal freedom and it has constrained it, it has imprisoned it, it has eroded our capacity for imagination. It has eroded our capacity to think that we have a right to decide what we put our energies into. That's necessary for our system. So there's this sense that if you want to change society, you need to change the education system. But if you want to change the education system, you need to create the spaces for the sorts of people that are going to be spat out of the education system. If you want to create autonomous, confident, free people, then you need a society that can accommodate autonomous, free, confident people. And that's not the society we have, because it simply doesn't meet the needs of capitalism, where you need obedient, servile workers. So yeah, that'd be my immediate response.
And now that you were starting to talk about education, which was also a question I had for you. During the COVID crisis, of course, a lot of things changed, and a lot of things went online for almost a year and a half. And then I think that the education with the online universe also started to get a sense of a transformation. I even heard, maybe that's not true, but I heard that Harvard is planning on closing its campus and in, I don't know, 10 years and making everything go online. And of course, we heard a lot of stories that we don't know if they're true. But of course, a lot of things are now going on the internet. And a lot of people are saying, oh no, without normal faculties and institutions like that, you'll not have people seeing each other face to face, going into groups, making, some kind of student movements. But then when we see the last, I don't know how many years, not a lot of political movements actually were so much from these campuses or from these closed institutions. There were much more movements that were movements of people that much more engaged through the internet as some kind of a free media where they can, talk wherever they want, whatever they want. So do you think that maybe in some kind of a future that education can be transformed by using the internet as a tool of something that would democratize it, like these Ivy League faculties where you have to pay hundreds of billions of dollars to study on, and most people don't have this money. But if the education was actually free, and if it was in a way really democratized, and if the knowledge was free, and that everybody could have a chance to get an education, a proper education, without having to travel to rent expensive places in London, New York, Boston, wherever, would this kind of an educational system maybe make free individuals in the future more like this virtual reality that we're so afraid of? Maybe it's not so much to be afraid of, because I don't know about you, but me during COVID pandemic and lockdown, I met a lot of interesting people through the internet that I really have a sense that I know now, and that we exchange some political ideas, and that I am a better person because of this kind of communication.
Yeah, I mean, look, these communication technologies are immensely powerful, and they can be used in wonderful ways and liberating ways. And to some extent, that's what I think you're trying to do with this podcast, and what many people are trying to do in many different respects. And of course, it's going to have a big impact on education. It should lower the costs, really, and enable access from all around the world to resources which up until now have only been open to a select few, an elite few. So I think potentially that's very positive. It can be very positive development. I think as part of that, I always want to say that education should not be something which continues till you're 20, 21. It should be lifelong. I mean, how crazy is it? What is education? Education is growth. It's the development of oneself, understanding oneself and understanding the world, and having those two engage in a beautiful interplay. That should never end. That's part of life, and we all benefit from it. You can't have functional democracies if people stop learning at 20. This seems to be a lifelong activity, and it was one of the things I got incredibly excited with when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. This was part of his manifesto, a national kind of an equivalent to the NHS, a national health service. He wanted a national education system, which was lifelong, and people could kind of dip in and dip out of according to their needs and interests. That's I think getting much closer to an ideal. Of course, it all comes down to your aims and purposes, and I think our aims, our values, what we think we should be working towards, they do not overlap with the functional needs of a system which requires obedience, servility, and power concentrated at the top of massive hierarchies. So yeah, it's a political fight. It's you could argue it's the most important political fight of all, to liberate and continually improve the way we are educating ourselves and each other, because we're talking about how we make human beings. We're talking about how you take the incredibly vast potential of every baby born into this world, and what you turn that into. And people have very different visions about what children should be turned into. But I think if it's liberation that you want in society, then you have to think about education as being absolutely central to that. And you want institutions which can facilitate that lifelong. But of course, then you need material equality. It's all bound up, you know.
Yeah, but this is a really interesting point that you just said, and that we should be educating ourselves until the rest of our lives. Because when you think of even good professors at universities that are teaching students, the best ones are not the ones that stopped, learning things when, I don't know, they were 40 or 50, when they wrote a couple of books and became famous. The best teachers are the ones that are still educating themselves day by day, every day. And that's their duty, to educate themselves so that this kind of a knowledge should be passed on to students. And of course, you have a few of professors that work in this kind of way, and you have most professors that will just stop at one point and have this historical means of just history ends here and you'll know about this, but everything that happens in contemporary society, I don't care about this. Just listen to what I have to tell you. But I also think that not just professors, I think that what you said, it should be normal for people in their 60s and 70s to have a meaningful life. If they're in pension, which is great, and they get money and then they don't have to go to work, but it would be great for them to be normal to continue an education that is for free, that they can continue educating themselves. And these people, it's also a matter of how you treat the elders that are really the people with the most knowledge. And if you would treat them as people that can still have more and more and more knowledge, they would be useful to themselves and also to society. Because when you think, when you talk to Noam Chomsky, who has been alive for more than 90 years, he has, of course, this great knowledge that he has, the knowledge of being alive, and of course, the knowledge of being Noam Chomsky. But then whenever I listen to him, I see that he's reading every day, and that's why I think that his brain is still powerful and he can still talk about the society, because he did not stop learning. And I think that the society and capitalism, what you said, they want us to stop learning, like in Carpenter's movie, They Live, just to become, these skeletons after we're 20-something, marry, reproduce, obey, money is our God, and that's that. And we finish with the whole package of having a good education, marrying a good person, going to pension and then die, having children, going to pension and then die, And I think that what you're talking is in a way very revolutionary, because I think if people would learn until they are alive, that their lives and the structures in their life and their inner freedom would be completely different than it is without the learning, And maybe then, the society would change eventually. They would be sick of looking at things as they are. Because if you read every day something that's telling you this is not normal, look what kind of society you're living in, la la la, you could not live in the way you are living. And then you would not be obedient, and then capitalism would fall eventually. But I think that you cannot do it with a group of individuals. You have to do it with the whole society, because that's, I think, the only way.
I agree with all of that. I'd add one dimension, which is just returning to, again, the distinction between the inner reality, the inner world, and the outer. And that the sort of education that I would envisage, that I think would be truly liberatory, is one which would dedicate at least half the time to internal knowledge, self-knowledge, to, again, what people around the world for millennia in various traditions have prioritized as the most important aspect of education, right? It's very common sense when you think about it. The tool, our mind is a tool with which we navigate reality. Everything springs from it. And yet in our society, we tend to spend all our time focused outwards instead of honing that tool, refining that tool, understanding that tool. And there are various practices, various ways of doing that. Meditation is an obvious one, but there are others. And I think that has to be absolutely integral, this sort of, for want of a better word, spiritual development. Because even if you could educate, if you get everyone in the world to read Marx, every child to read Marx, a good critique of capitalism, a good sense of alternative ways of organizing humanity, I don't think it would be enough. We might end up with something quite different to capitalism, but I think it would be a very lopsided form of development. And all the problems which originate ultimately from ego, for want of a better word, human ego, they would find new ways of manifesting themselves. And so we need an education system which is as much grounded on the internal reality, because in the end, our external realities reflect our internal realities. And so I'd want that sort of parity, that balance. I sometimes think of Marx's dictum that, the point isn't simply to understand the world, but to change it. And of course he's right, but I kind of want to insert something that I feel is missing between those two, which is to connect to the world, to learn to love the world, and in the process, have yourself changed. Because if we don't find a way to change ourselves, to learn about ourselves, our great potential for both beauty, but also ugliness, for love and compassion, but also hatred and oppression, that every one of us holds all of these potentials within us. If that's not central, the understanding of how these things develop and how to cultivate one more than the other, if that's not at the heart, then we're going to manifest new problems the day after the revolution, right? So any revolution worth its salt has to be this truly holistic program, which brings us back to one of the main problems with the education system, which is that we're taught to carve the world up into various topics. And then we forget that we have imposed this categorization on reality. We didn't discover it in reality, we imposed it. And if we don't remember to then put all the pieces back together and have a holistic view, which includes ourselves in that picture, the inner, internal, interiority reality. If we don't do that, then we end up with very lopsided intellectual life. And I think we're an impoverished view of what's possible and how to change things.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And then it goes to the part, the notion of empathy, which you also talk about in your latest book that you wrote after creating freedom. And the notion that you have to have empathy towards the other human being who was not born into the same family, social structures as you, and you cannot judge somebody because he's different than you. You have to think of himself, of this person, of somebody that has a completely different childhood than you had, and his birth was different than yours. And I think that this is also a notion of this world after the day after the revolution, when you have to confront people that are different than you. It's easy to confront people that are the same as you, but this is also the thing I think that they should learn, children in school, which they obviously don't. And that is differences, lots of differences that we have, and in a way, even the bad differences, if you have, I don't know, a boy that is, I don't know, being very aggressive, you have to see why the boy is being aggressive, not like punish him. Maybe this boy has an aggressive father at home beating him up. You have to go, and that's what you were telling you, because you have to have a system that integrates everything, not just like the political structures, but also to think the notion of the family as the basic political structure we are born into, And that comes to my favorite question, which you did not deal in your books and your movie, but I'm really interested in what you think about it. And that is the notion of the nuclear family, which has not existed for like a long time, but it seems like it has. like the notion of the nuclear family being the only unit that is official. It's like the only legal unit. You can be alone, an individual, or you can be in a nuclear family. And transforming all these structures. Do you think that also this notion of a nuclear family should also be considered to have a transformation? Because I think that in this new reality where people would be learning a lot about each other, they would maybe think, I want to live with 4 people. I want to, have this marriage of 4 friends, and I want my 4 friends to be able to buy an apartment together or I don't know what, these different kinds of families that can function, but I think that they are really only at this point we look at them as some kind of weird communities, but at the end, do you think that we need the transformation of the nuclear family also, with, of course, the fall of patriarchy and everything I would like to happen in the future?
Yeah, look, I mean, okay, big question. I mean, yes, we need the fall of patriarchy, and we need to restore the sacred feminine to a position of prevalence within our societies. And particularly men, I think, need to rediscover those parts within ourselves, the characteristics and traits which have been associated with women and which are sort of rigidly policed in our society. Whether you're a man or woman, you're told how to relate to your own internal emotions and what you're allowed to express and what you're not. In terms of a nuclear family, what you want is a society that allows people to love each other and to build structures to raise new human beings in different ways without stigma. But I don't think the form itself is the key issue here. I think there could be nuclear families which would be incredibly loving places, conducive to the development of confident, compassionate human beings. And there will be incredibly repressive nuclear families. If we're talking about kind of traditional, I don't know, parents and 2 children, I don't focus so much on the form as much as the principles and the values underlying that form, animating that form. That's what seems really important to me. But it does seem clear that we need to step away from just isolated units and to increase connections, deeper bonds, binding communities together. I mean, that seems, it's in socialism, it's in the name, right? Social, we need more sociality, we need more connections with others. I don't think at this point there's anything more radical than emphasizing and foregrounding the ways in which human beings are connected. It's extremely important to understand how human beings are different, all the things that separate us, all the ways in which our identities are different. But that alone is never enough. We need, at the very same time, to be doing the opposite. We need a kind of universalism with this specific kind of intersectional breakdown. If we lose the universalism, the sense of what unites everyone, the sense that our commonalities far outweigh that which separates us. If we lose that, I think we get into real trouble, and strategically we undermine our capacity to bind together and form the sorts of movements that would actually have the power to win the kind of change that we want. So we need to be doing both at the same time, increasing our resolution in terms of understanding the individual and all the ways that aspects of their identity affect their lives, but also saying, don't lose sight of the fact that ultimately, underneath all those layers of identity, we're incredibly similar. Perhaps we're the same. I mean, there are many traditions across culture and time which have arrived at this conclusion. We're ultimately made of the same stuff. And I've been talking about the education of trying to understand our internal world better, and that this has been crucial to changing society. And in the traditions around the world that have prioritized this, they teach that we should, in a sense, dissociate, disconnect, disidentify is the word, disidentify with the voice in our head. disidentify with the external labels that others try to slap on us, and the social position that we find ourselves in, and the material objects that apparently we own. And realize there is a more fundamental self, more fundamental even than gender. And that only in recognition and deep identification with this more fundamental self is there the possibility for real freedom, for real joy, for real peace. And in that sense, there is universality, because we're all in that position. There's also universality in the sense that not a single human being on this planet, whether they're an angel or a devil, a tyrant, none of us chose to have the identity that we have. None of us chose to have the biology or the environmental, familial, cultural forces that we had. We're all in that same boat. None of us have ultimate responsibility for who we are. We didn't create ourselves. And the thing I love about this position, as well as it being empirically grounded, supported by the best science and just internally logical, it absolutely leads necessarily, I think, to a compassionate, empathetic worldview. It removes blame from the equation. And as much as I identify with being on the left, and I think the left is a wonderful thing and ultimately the vehicle for improving the world, there is a lot of, there are toxic cultures on the left, toxic cultures of blame, kind of punitive instincts, and an absence of compassion quite often. And I think that's a problem. I think we need those elements of empathy and compassion at the very heart.
And I think this is a perfect moment to see the other excerpts from your movie about alternatives.
I think one reason it is so important to break out of the prison of the monoculture of the mind is to recognize that this world has so many alternatives. There's so many alternatives to the industrial agriculture based on fossil fuels and chemicals. There's so many alternatives to a banking system based on fraud. There's so many alternatives to the unrepresentative representative democracy. We live under conditions of deep economic insecurity. And this kind of economic insecurity, of course, is depriving people of basic needs, but it is also the fertile ground for cultures of hatred, cultures of violence, cultures of killings. If we just want our children to grow up in a culture of peace, we need to be sure we work and build the alternatives that will create that culture of peace for future generations. What keeps me going is some very basic things. One, I know I'm part of this beautiful planet, of this universe, and I must play my role in it. I am connected, and therefore I do what needs to be done. If biodiversity has to be protected, I'll protect it. If rivers like the Ganges have to be protected, I'll protect them. The second thing that keeps me going is an abhorrence for injustice. I think every human being needs to have security, freedom, and dignity. And every time it's violated, I want to be there to make sure that violation doesn't take place. And the third thing that keeps me going is really the beauty of this world, the beauty of people. And I'd rather participate in building on that beauty than see the ugliness of devastation, of forests torn down by bulldozers, of rivers rubbished by waste dumping, and people rubbished by an economy that has no place for them. So beauty, for sure, is a very important part of what keeps me going.
When we were talking a couple of days ago, you said something to me which I really liked, and I would like to say it now out loud, and you can maybe add something to it. And that is that art needs more politics, but politics needs more spirituality from art. And with combining these two things, we would actually be able to make a better world in a sense. So would you add anything to this?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back, it sort of connects to what I said before, that it's a mistake to try and understand the world or ourselves through any one lens, through any one framework, through any one ideology. Even a framework as broad as politics, which ultimately is characterized, by understanding the dynamics of power. It's a fantastically useful lens, but it's limited, it's constrained. It doesn't capture all that is important about life and society. And when we're talking about revolution, we're not simply talking about reorganizing the way power is sort of shared out in society, how it functions. Because what we call political problems aren't truly simply political. They're also psychological. They are spiritual. They are related to the meaning crisis. They are related to metaphysical assumptions about who we are, what life is about, and the nature of reality. Everything is connected. And when we ignore those connections, although it's useful and necessary in points when we're focusing on specific things, but if we do that too often and we forget the bigger picture, the relationship between the inner and the outer, the relationship between art and politics, between spirituality and even science, we run into trouble. Our analysis becomes impoverished. And also, I think we shoot ourselves in the foot strategically, because it's funny, in certain ways, the political right has been more sophisticated in this respect. We may have left the terrain of spirituality thinking it's not to do with politics, but the right, in a very highly problematic way, but nevertheless highly effective way, have entered that terrain and have used it to benefit their own agenda very effectively, decade after decade, cultivating certain religious identities and making elections about the values associated with those identities instead of, who is advantaged economically or not.
But not just that, the right is also giving the people a sense of meaning, the same as which happened, before World War II, that people need money, but they also need a meaning. And when they have a meaning, when they feel the emotions to be a part of a society, and I think that that has to be really, really quickly hijacked from the right, because I think we are now living in a society where the right can really take over the meaning and the emotions that I think the left lost because of the intellectualization of the whole thing, because I really don't care if I don't understand. And I think that the problem with left ideas today is that most people don't understand what people are talking about. They need something to understand and which they can emotionally relate to.
Meaning is perhaps the most important need that human beings have. Ultimately, more important even than material needs. People will sacrifice literally their life if something is meaningful enough to them. And we have a society under the system of capitalism which assiduously, systematically destroys the sources of meaning for human beings, and then commodifies that need. It creates addicts out of all of us by saying that the path to filling the hole that we feel because we have no meaning is consumption. Now, the right understands this, and of course it feeds off this, but it goes a step further by allying itself with notions of nationalism, notions of very formal hierarchical religious identities. And there are problems with both of them, but we have to see that they are meeting a need. And that if you're going to transcend those problematic forms, then you have to address that need at the heart of your politics. It's not a side issue. It's absolutely central. It's going to determine whether people are attracted to your movement or not, whether they're attracted to the vision of the future or not. If all you talk about is geared to making people feel guilty or scared to say this or scared to say that, or you're only talking about, you know, the negative, the power structures, it can get very dry. And just the way I think of art as a part of this picture and as a way of contributing politically relates actually to the first clip you showed, about people not being able to think beyond capitalism. What Mark Fisher, I think, called capital realism, where it's easier to sort of imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Well, art, for me, what art does is it has a power to shift us into different states of consciousness. It can break a frame. It can break our set of assumptions. Where language and mathematics breaks down as descriptions of reality, art can continue. It can take us where those things cannot take us. And not by describing a new state, a new way of being, a new vision, but sort of like spells, sort of like incantations, which create in you a new state. A bit like, you know, they can transport you into a new way of being, at least temporarily. And in doing so, possibilities open up, horizons open up. They can do that in very definite ways. For example, showing you what it's like to live the life that you haven't lived through, let's say, literature, through the stories of film. They can transport you, you know, across the world. What is it like to cross an ocean on a dinghy as an immigrant? It can do that, but it can do it in more abstract ways too, which are equally important, which connect you to sources of meaning and beauty, which they may seem quite abstract, but just like when you're, let's say, in love, the world looks completely different and everything seems possible. Art can do that. And if we remove that ingredient, that dimension from our politics, then we sort of spiral downwards. I think what the possibilities we're able to contemplate and the levels that we're able to reach within other people, they sort of contract. So it's all connected, and we have to cultivate all of ourselves, and then bring all of ourselves to these problems and challenges.
Yeah, you're completely right. And I had an honor to see a new documentary series that you have been doing, and that is going to be out in a while. And thank you for that. It is called In the Eye of the Storm, The World According to Yanis Varoufakis. It's a 6-episode documentary series. And I really enjoyed it. I still haven't seen the last episode, but I really enjoying watching it, and really thank you for giving me the privilege to be one of the first ones to see it. And I wanted to ask you just one question concerning the documentary. For me, it was really interesting to see how this story about political movement, as it was Syriza, you know, which we all, where we in Eastern Europe and in Serbia were very much involved in Syriza, like it was happening here, because I think that we thought, okay, if this happens in Greece, maybe it will happen here also. And I think that the fall of Syriza was, for my country, also a big disappointment, because we thought, okay, this is the beginning of a global international movement, because we knew that we could not do it alone. Of course, we're a small country in Eastern Europe. And it was very emotional for me to watch your documentary. I even cried at one point with the episode with the referendum, because we had the same experience here in Serbia with failed revolutions. And of course, a lot of people had, but I think in the south of Europe mostly. And I wanted to ask you, because for me the documentary was great, because it didn't it's not a documentary about Varoufakis, it's not a documentary about Syriza or anything else. It's a documentary of Europe and the world after the world economic crisis in 2008. You actually see through the lens of what happened to a small country that was in debt after the crisis. You see actually what happened to the world, what happened to Europe, and then what happened to the rest of the, not world, but West. And it's a very powerful and important documentary. I haven't seen the final episode. It's probably the one that gives hope. So I wanted to ask you, do you see a progressive international as a political option, the Green New Deal as an alternative that can bring some kind of a new political idea that can happen at the end and not fail as these political projects failed.
Well, first of all, thanks for what you said about the series. It's kind of just freshly finished as a work, and we're just in the process of looking of raising finishing funds and then distributing it. But I hope it can see the light of day soon and connect with an audience. As far as Progressive International goes, I think it's a fantastic enterprise. I love the ambition. I love the vision. It's trying to, in terms of its vision, it's trying to meet the scale of the problem. And few organizations, few groups have actually managed that. So I think that's a fantastic achievement. In terms of a Green New Deal, a global Green New Deal, look, it's the only thing that's going to work. It's the only thing, that's what it's got in its favor, that everyone, literally everyone, stands ultimately to benefit from it working. Because technically, yes, there is still time to avert a lot of the troubles that otherwise we're going to encounter if we continue on our current path. There is still time, there's still incredibly valuable, important things to be done. Will it be done? Well, we have to do we have to make it happen. We have to do everything we possibly can. But our system is incredibly irrational. It exists from our perspective as beings that want to survive, that beings that want people in the future to flourish. It's incredibly irrational. Of course, from the logic of capital, it's not irrational, it's highly functional. So that's a challenge we face. No manifesto on the planet has come close to really promising and committing to what's necessary. Relative to what's come before, a president like Biden has done a relatively decent job in putting forward a vision for change, but relative to the demands of the crisis, what he's putting forward falls so far short that that leaves us a lot of work to do to push him a lot further. But yes, look, this is what we have to be fighting for. A global Green New Deal is what we need. It's the only thing, and we need to. It just has to be as ambitious as possible, and we have to ensure that the global North basically understands that it has to degrow and allow the global South to grow. Otherwise, if you don't have that kind of solidarity, that level of universality, which again is going to be predicated on compassion, empathy, and all the rest of it. If we don't have that, if we don't cultivate this level of consciousness, there's not a way forward. There's simply the implosion of our civilization, which, is something to be avoided at all costs.
Thank you, Raul, for being our guest tonight. And this is the final episode before our little summer break. We are leaving for vacation. Voice TV is going on vacation, and we are coming back in September with lots of new interesting guests. And thank you really, Raul, for being our guest tonight.
Oh, well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.